Hello, St. Mark's. It's good to be with you this morning. Today, as you know, is the fourth Sunday in Lent, which means we are in it. We are deep in the wilderness now. The rocky, shadowed path we started walking on Ash Wednesday stretches for miles behind us, and yet we still have some distance to cover before we reach its end. Many of us are tired. All of us, in the challenging particulars of our own lives, long for resurrection. Still, there is a kind of relief, a kind of hard-edged blessing that comes in the middle of a journey. Here, miles from where we started and miles from where we hope to end up, we find an odd kind of freedom. We lose our need to sound chipper, to keep up appearances, to pretend that we are anything other than dogged, determined, and weary. We admit now that we're traversing a land without shortcuts, a land that offers us little choice but to stay on the winding path we've chosen and keep walking one step at a time. Here, on this path, it becomes okay to talk about the hard things, the scary, biting, poisonous things. Here, in the heart of Lent, it becomes okay to talk about the snakes. In the readings we just heard, we have a pairing of two stories, one from the Old Testament book of Numbers and one from the Gospel of John. Both mention snakes or serpents, and in the Gospel reading, Jesus goes so far as to compare himself to a snake. What are we to make of that? Lent, of course, is a season when we think a great deal about the cross. What happened on the cross exactly? What did Jesus' death mean? Why do our historic creeds and liturgies teach us that Jesus' death paved the way for our salvation? What theology of the cross or theology of atonement gets to the heart of what really happened on Good Friday? I spent many years agonizing over these questions, as if the mystery of the cross, God's great unfolding of love, grace, mercy, judgment, pain, and reconciliation, wouldn't hold and wouldn't work unless I pinned it down and figured it out. Thankfully, I no longer believe this. What I believe instead is that the cross offers us an abundance of riches, a treasure of meanings, approaches, angles, truths, and metaphors. The gift God gives us in Jesus' death is the gift of contemplation, not the gift of perfect comprehension. Today, our readings about snakes offer us one way in, one way to contemplate the mystery of the cross. It's not an exclusive or exhaustive way, but it's a compelling one that I think speaks powerfully to our time and place. So, let's talk about snakes. In our reading from the Hebrew Bible, we get the last in a long sequence of complaint stories. Earlier in the same sequence, the Israelites, wandering in the wilderness after their liberation from slavery, complained that their drinking water is bitter. So God sweetens it. They complained that they're starving. So God feeds them manna. They complain that they're thirsty. So God provides more water. They complain that they're sick of manna and need meat. So God offers them flocks of quail. In other words, in one wearying episode after another, the people of God find themselves so undone by their circumstances that they lose sight of the God who loves them. They forget what it means to trust that God is sufficient for the desert, sufficient for their hungers, sufficient for the long, winding journey from slavery to freedom. In fact, they fix their eyes so completely on their hardships that they forget the joy of freedom itself. and tell God that they'd rather return to the chains and degradations of Egypt than spend one more day in the desert with a God whose ways they can't manipulate or control. That is the backdrop to this morning's story. Now, as we heard read, the people once again despair of the lives they're living and turn against the God who made that unchained life possible. Soon enough, they find themselves helpless in the throes of a dangerous and terrifying infestation. Their wandering leads them into a nest of poisonous snakes. The snakes bite them, and several of them die. It's not an easy story. To our contemporary ears, it of course sounds ghastly because it raises such thorny questions about sin and judgment. It's definitely a story to wrestle with, and I invite you to do so. But for the purposes of contemplating Lent and the cross, I want to focus on what happens next. According to the text, the people repent of their sin and beg Moses to pray on their behalf. When Moses does so, God says, "Make a poisonous serpent and set it on a pole, and everyone who is bitten shall look at it and live." As instructed, Moses makes the serpent of bronze, and as instructed, the people look up at that snake when they're bitten. As soon as they do so, their snake bites are healed and they live. Okay, now fast forward several centuries to our New Testament reading, which records a conversation between Jesus and a Pharisee named Nicodemus. When Nicodemus approaches Jesus under cover of night, bursting with questions about God and meaning and life and the universe, the two men enter into a long dialogue. At one point in that dialogue, Jesus refers back to the ancient story of the wandering Israelites, a story that a religious leader like Nicodemus would know inside out, and draws a parallel. Just as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up, that whoever believes in him may have eternal life. Just as Moses lifted up the serpent, so must the Son of Man be lifted up. What a bizarre comparison, the loving, saving Messiah to the bronze replica of a poisonous snake. What does it mean? As I reflect on the two stories side by side, I wonder if Jesus is telling us something about perspective, about seeing, about casting our eyes in a new and less comfortable direction so that we can be healed. In the Old Testament story, God requires the Israelites to look up, to reorient themselves. God invites them to gaze full on at the monstrous thing their sin has conjured. It's the thing they fear, the thing they desperately don't want to face because it's the thing they've set loose by their own faithlessness, their own wandering. It's the thing that will surely kill them unless God, in God's mercy, intervenes. In order to be saved, the people have to confront the serpent. They have to look hard at what harms, poisons, breaks, and kills them. As they look, they have to trust that God is present and powerful even in the company of the snakes, even in the blistering pain, even in the heart of what looks and feels like poison. Sometimes it's hard to understand that the kind of love that will save us might wound us first. In this case, the Israelites who dare to follow Moses' hard instruction see in the serpent the outworkings of their own failure to hang on to God. They understand that their ongoing failure to trust has stakes. It matters. They learn that what they need is not belief in the sense of intellectual assent to a set of propositions about God. What they need is full-bodied, heart and soul, bottom-line confidence in God's unending goodness, presence, provision, and love. Hence the snake, which forces them to stare the poison down until they see in it the grief, the anger, the judgments, and the unending compassion of a God whose love is vast but tough, deep but demanding. It's a love that heals but also exposes truth. It's a love that delivers because it demands a change in perspective, a shift in apprehension, a bitter but ultimately salvific looking up. So, what might this story of a serpent on a pole illuminate about the cross of Christ? The Gospels teach us that Jesus came to earth to declare and embody the coming of God's kingdom, a beautiful, radical kingdom of peace, of restorative, not retributive justice, of deep and abiding love, grace, freedom, and hope. The kingdom Jesus came to reveal is a kingdom without violence, without oppression, without exploitation, without greed. In short, a kingdom dramatically unlike the all too broken, all too human one Jesus was born into. So why did he die? He died because he unflinchingly stood for that kingdom, that promise, that vision. And insofar as that vision threatened the comfort and complacency of the powerful killed him. Jesus died because he exposed the ungracious sham at the heart of all of our human kingdoms, holding up a mirror that shocked his contemporaries and still shocks us at the deepest levels of our imaginations. In other words, he unveiled the poison. He showed us the snake. He revealed what our human kingdoms, left to themselves, will always become, unless God, in God's mercy, delivers us. In the cross, we are invited to see, as the Israelites in the wilderness saw, what our addiction to slavery, our refusal to love, our indifference to suffering, our craving for violence, our resistance to change, our terror of difference, our obsession with judgment, and our fear of the other must wreak. When Jesus is lifted up, we recognize with chilling and urgent clarity the serpents we human beings are capable of unleashing, and at the very same time we see our desperate need for a God who can take our most horrific instruments of death and transform them at great cost for the purposes of resurrection. I know that many of us grew up in religious contexts where the concepts of sin and judgment were used to shame us. But I wonder if the story of the snakes can help us to see the cross in a new way, not as a weapon of shame and condemnation, but as a place of profound revelation, a place where our brokenness is honestly named and lovingly healed. I said at the outset that this metaphor of the serpent is a particularly apt one for our time and place. Can you see why? We are living in a moment when some of the oldest and most insidious infestations of snakes are being revealed in our midst. We saw it last May, during those 9 unbearable moments when George Floyd struggled to draw breath beneath a racist policeman's knee. We've been seeing it over the past 4 years as millions of women around the world have come forward with stories of abuse, exploitation, violence, and rape, crying, "Me too, me too, me too." We've seen it at our southern border in the guise of helpless children taken from their parents and confined in cages. We've seen it in droughts and fires, hurricanes and floods, the silent pleas of a planet in crisis. We saw it on January 6th, when the stamping out of truth led to chaos and death at our capital. We are seeing it now as the pandemic continues to deepen the racial and economic inequalities we've quietly ignored for decades too long. We have to look in order to be saved. We have to see and name the snake before we can defang it. We have to know what we ourselves in our humanness and brokenness might inflict on ourselves and on each other, but for the vast mercy and saving power of God. The bronze snake was not magical. It was not meant to be idolized. Neither is the cross we contemplate during this Lenten season. But insofar as the cross invites us to look up, to reorient ourselves, and to depend wholly on God to bring life out of death, light out of shadow, and healing out of pain, then the cross functions as a sacrament, a means of grace. It reminds us that belief is far more than a cognitive exercise. To believe in the power of the cross is to rely on Jesus for our very lives. It is to trust that the lifting up of Jesus, painful though it is to our eyes, is our best hope, our best anti-venom, our sure means of rescue. Where is our gaze focused as we continue our Lenten journey? What occupies our attention in the desert? Can we look up at the cross and see in it God's healing love, promising us that new life can be ours now? The cross is a great mystery, and that is as it should be. It's okay not to understand. The invitation is to see. So look up. Don't be afraid. Don't refuse the sting. Don't turn away. Look up and be saved.